Okay, so it's been a little while since we've done one of these videos. We've predominantly looked at, or at least previously, we looked at the Torah in response to some of the claims that the Quran made. What I want to do now is actually focus on the Torah itself. Now that we've established its reliability, let's see what the Torah actually teaches. Let's explore the Torah on its own merits. Okay? I think we're going to have a lot of fun doing this. So we're going to look at the Torah to establish a couple of points. One, sin results in death and corruption. Two, the blood atonement for sin. So how do we make right with the sin committed? Three, God appeared as a man in the Old Testament, so within the Torah particularly. Four, who is the suffering servant? And then five, looking at the gospel message overall. Now, given these topics, I'm probably going to chunk it down into bite sizes. So today, I'm looking to cover just the first 2 points, okay? So let's talk about sin. So what is sin? What is the definition of sin? So sin really is the act of disobedience to God, okay? It's the act of disobeying and rebelling against God. So the Torah teaches that sin, as a result of sin, as a result of disobeying God, rebelling against God, it results in death and corruption and explains the broken world we live in today and why human nature can suck sometimes. Okay, why there's so much evil in the world and brokenness in the world, and we'll get to that. Okay, so let's look at Genesis 2, verse 15. The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and keep it. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, You may surely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you shall surely die. So let's unpack that a little bit. God has created Adam, the first man, in the Garden of Eden, and he's given Adam a responsibility. The responsibility is to look after his creation, what God has created. But also, he gives some rules to Adam to abide by. He tells Adam that he can eat anything from the garden apart from anything from one specific tree, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. He is not to eat from that tree. Okay? Let's read on verse 24. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. So later on in Genesis, in the Torah, we learn that God created a wife for Adam, the first woman named Eve. And both Adam and Eve were naked and were not ashamed. And this is important. So keep this in the back of the mind that they were naked and were not ashamed. Okay? Let's read on in Genesis 3. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate, and she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both were open, and they knew that they were naked, and that they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths. And they heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God among the trees of the garden. But the Lord God called to the man and said to him, Where are you? And he said, I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid, because I was naked, and I hid myself. He said, Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten of the tree of which I commanded you not to eat? The man said, The woman who you gave to be with me, she gave me fruit of the tree, and I ate. Then the Lord God said to the woman, What is this you have done? The woman said, The serpent deceived me, and I ate. So there's a lot there, so let's unpack that. So what we didn't read here is the serpent. So the serpent is a spiritual being from the kingdom of Satan. Okay, and the serpent deceives Eve, the woman, and tricks her into eating that one fruit from the tree that God said not to eat from. Okay, and she saw the fruit and she ate it. All right, and what's really important here is that her husband Adam was present with her, and at no time did Adam stop and say, Eve, don't do it. Okay, it's almost like Adam was curious himself. He probably thought to himself, well, I won't eat from the fruit, but let's see what happens if she eats it. And is she going to die? So then she eats it and she hasn't died. Okay, so he's like, oh, okay. and her eyes were open, and she became wise. She had the knowledge. And so Adam thought to himself, well, I'll have some as well. So obviously Eve offers some to Adam, and they were both of their eyes were opened. And they realized, because of that knowledge, that they were naked, and they felt a sense of shame for being naked. Okay. And so they made some clothes through branches and tree leaves, and sort of covered their private areas. Then God comes in, and we see a bit of a blame game going on. God says, "Oh, you're not naked. That means you've eaten from that tree I told you not to eat from. You've disobeyed me. You've rebelled against what I've said not to do." And we see Adam says, "Well, it's not my fault. It was a woman. It was Eve. She made me eat it." And then the woman says, "No, no, no, it's not my fault. It was the serpent's fault." So what we see here is, rather than Adam and Eve either or both being accountable and saying, "Sorry, God, we're really sorry. Yes, we disobeyed you, and I'm sorry for that." What we see is actually no accountability, just blaming somebody else, just pointing fingers and blaming somebody else, and not taking accountability for their own actions. Okay, so as a result of sin, as a result of their disobedience, their rebelliousness, there has to be consequence. And remember, sin results in death and corruption. So let's look at that corruption a little bit more and the death piece. So God says to Adam, "Because you have listened to the voice of your wife, and you have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return." So God pronounces the consequences of their sin. And that is the broken world we see today. Because of Adam and Eve's sin, they opened the floodgate of sin for all mankind. So everybody has this innate propensity to sin, this sort of bentness towards sin. And that's probably why we see a lot of problems in the world as a result of sin. And later on, we learn actually that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, apart from one. And we'll talk about that a bit later. But essentially, as a result, man will always work hard in order to cultivate fruit. Through the thorns and thistles, it will bring forth the fruit. And that death will occur. Probably not instantaneously, but for dust you shall return. So now they will no longer live for all eternity, but actually they will return to the ground when they die eventually. Let's read on in Genesis 3. Then the Lord God said, "Behold, the man has become like one of us in knowledge, in knowing good and evil. Now, lest he reach out his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever." And therefore the Lord God sent him out from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he was taken. He drove out the man and at the east of Garden of Eden, and so on and so forth. So what we're learning here is that as a result, they are no longer able to eat from the tree of life, okay, and live forever. So therefore, there is going to be death. We've seen corruption, how the land will be difficult to till in order to cultivate food, fruit, whatever. And now we've seen death because they're not going to be able to live forever, okay? So what is blood atonement for sin? Well, the Torah teaches us that God has created a system in order to help people get right with God, put them in a right relationship with God. And so for the sins that mankind will commit, there is a way to atone temporarily. And we see the first evidence of this blood atonement in the Garden of Eden at the time when Adam and Eve had disobeyed God and eaten from the tree they were not supposed to. We see in verse 20, the man called his wife name Eve because she was the mother of all living. And the Lord God made for Adam and for his wife garments of skin and clothed them. So we see that God created clothes from animal skin. So therefore, the first death that occurred was via an animal, so that the animal skin could be used to atone for Adam and Eve's sin and their sense of shame by giving them clothes. So we see here the first blood sacrifice, the first animal sacrifice to atone for sin. Atone just means to get right with God. Okay. And then we see in Leviticus 17, which is further down in the Torah, how God sets up a system of blood atonement, okay, of animal sacrifice to atone for these sins. So let's read together. If any one of the house of Israel or the strangers who sojourn among them eats any blood, I will set my face against that person who eats blood and will cut him off from among his people. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you on the altar to make atonement for your souls. For it is the blood that makes atonement by the life. Therefore I have said to the people of Israel, no person among you shall eat blood, neither shall any stranger who sojourns among you eat blood. So what God is saying, he's saying that blood contains life and that no one should eat blood. Particularly the people of Israel, because during this time, around the pagan nations around them would often make blood sacrifices, drink blood, eat blood, and so on and so forth. And God is setting them apart to say, actually, that's wrong. The blood has life, and only God can create life, so you are not to eat blood. However, you are to make blood sacrifices through animal sacrifices in order to atone, because the blood contains the life. This will atone for the sins committed by the people of Israel. Okay, and we see the first evidence of that in Genesis 3 in the Garden of Eden. So we'll leave it there. Okay, so we've seen what sin is, how sin led to death and a broken, fallen world, and how God had created a system in the Torah for the people of Israel to make right with God by atoning for these sins. And we'll talk about that in a bit more detail as we go along this study. And the next time I record a video, we'll start to look at in the Torah how God appeared as a man in the Old Testament. So up until now, we've seen that Adam and Eve sinned, they disobeyed God, and therefore they opened up the floodgate of sin that all mankind now have a desire or a pull or an attraction to do the things that are not of God, to do the things that are wrong, to commit sin, to disobey God. Okay. And that's really important to keep in our mind, because we'll see ultimately how this is corrected by God's sort of providence and his foreknowledge and planning. All right. So if there's any questions, any comments, any room for discussion, please share. I'm always happy to work through any challenges you may have, any clarity needed, and so on. All right. Cool. All right. Bye.